So I've pressed the seam open after I attach the head, and then I've reinforced the stitching on the spots where the ears and the tail are going to go. And now it's time to just cut in the middle line between the stitching, and make sure you don't cut through the threads on the point. Here you have the unicorn ear. You cut 2 of the back of the ear and 2 of the front of the ear. I'm putting light pink in the front. So what you're going to do is take 1 of each and put them right sides together. And then you're just going to stitch your 1/4 inch seam around the outside edge, and you're going to leave the bottom open for turning. So here it is stitched. Now you're going to want to trim the seam and clip the point off, but don't clip the stitching. It might also help to do a little couple snips in the curve. And now you can turn it right side out. I don't want my ears to be totally flat, so I like to take just a tiny bit of stuffing. Tiny, tiny little bit of stuffing. Stuff it in there. And now I'm going to put a decorative top stitch around the inside edge, and I'm going to stitch across the bottom end of the ear. The next step is to fold the corners in along the straight edge, like that, and stitch across the bottom again to hold it in place. Now you're going to attach the ear to the head, so right along next to the slit you're going to place the ear so that it's facing with the back towards the head, in the bottom of the slit really close to where it ends at the point, and you're going to stitch that on there. So after I stitched the ear to the edge of the space, I folded it over and then I stitched again along the stitching lines. And I tried to make sure I caught the stitching line that I used when I put the ear on, so that I wouldn't see any of that in there. And so now the ear's attached. I'm making the fringe for the mane, and I'm cutting just a 1/2 inch from the fold line. I took my rectangular piece and I folded it in half. And I'm doing them about a 1/4 inch apart. So that's the mane. I folded the long piece in half, and I did that every 1/2 inch, and then that's the tail. So now that you've got the mane cut, it's time to attach it to one side of the body. So just a little bit in front of the stitching, you're going to pin it to the head and the neck. And you're going to make sure you don't catch the ear in there. And then you're going to stitch it to the body. So I've stitched it to the edge. Now it's nice and funky and twisty and twirly. And it's time to put the 2 body pieces together. So I want to make sure that the hair is all contained inside. And I'm going to pin the body pieces together. From the part in the chest here where I've attached the head to the body, I'm going to stitch up and around the whole body, the whole head, and then the body till I get to the point where my slice is, and I'll stop the stitching. And then I'm going to go past the slice, and I'm just going to stitch to the end of the butt. To make the unicorn horn, you just take the 2 straight sides of the horn, fold it right sides together, and stitch the 1 seam. Turning that point can be rather tricky, so you might want to use a push stick old knit needle or a chopstick or something to get in there and get that point poking right out. Takes a little bit of finagling. Here we go. And that's that. Before you turn your unicorn right side out, it's good to clip the curves. So everywhere that there's a point that goes in, you clip it right to the stitching so that you don't have any puckers when you turn it right side out. Don't cut through the threads, you'll have a problem later. It's also good to clip the curves. Now the next thing you're going to do, you're going to make sure that the mane that's inside there is pushed all the way out of the way so that the forehead is laying nice and flat. This is where we're going to put the placement hole for the unicorn horn. Now I want to go back in before I cut that hole out. I'm going to cut it all the way to the seam. And I want to back tack a little bit along the seam line here and here so that when I cut the hole out, the seam doesn't unravel. So there it is, I've cut the hole. And now I can take my horn and I'll put the seam towards the back of the head. I'm going to stuff it in the hole. Just like that. And I want to make sure that the horn edges and the fabric edges of the head are right sides together and that they're laying nice and flat. And it's going to be really hard to get the sewing machine foot in there to stitch, but if you can, you're going to want to stitch a 1/4 of an inch seam all the way around. If not, just take a needle and thread and tack it around so that it stays in place. So now I've sewn it all the way around, and it's a good time to stuff it before you pull it right side out again because it's easier to get at it from here. So I'm going to try to stuff it. You want to put a lot in there, you want it to be kind of stiff. Once you get it started, it goes right in. And you want to encourage it down to the point. Okay, so now we can turn it right side out. Let's see what it looks like. So after you've got your unicorn right side out again, and you're ready to put the tail on, you want to flip it so that you're looking at the rear end. And you take your long rectangular piece of fleece and you fold it in half, and then you're going to slice up every 1/4 of an inch to make the tail. You're going to keep it folded in half, and I'm going to turn under a little bit. I'm going to turn it in like I turned in the ears. And I'm going to attach that to my seam right at that opening, and that's going to end up being the tail. So I'm just going to stitch that across. Once I've got it stitched in place, I'm going to fold my slice there right sides together, and I'm going to stitch across a little bit in from the stitching line to close that hole up. So I've got the tail attached. Now it's time to sew the whole thing together. So I want to get these things so that they're inside the body, kind of facing the rear end. And then I want to take my underbelly piece that already has the hoofs attached, and I want to make sure the single notches at the front feet are facing the front. And I want to match up all of the feet with their counterpart. So I want to show you how I pinned it. This is the rear end of the animal. And what I started at the rear leg, and I pinned, and I made sure that my hoof seam was matching as I went around. And again, I made sure my other hoof seam was matching. And then when I got to the spot between the legs, I made sure that my points in here were matching so that I could pivot nicely on those points. And again, I made sure my front hoof seams were matching, and then I worked my way around and I made sure that that point was matching the belly seam so that I could pivot inside there as I'm turning the corner. And then again, I made sure the rest of my hoof seams were matching. And there's the other belly side and the last one on the leg, and then I ended up right there. And I left this stuff kind of hanging out of the rear end so it's easy to turn right side out. So now I'm going to stitch it. The key to success here is stitching nice and slowly and making sure that everything's lined up. Here I'm coming to the point under the neck, and I want to make sure that my seam is opened up under there, and it is. And my goal is to stop, to pivot right on the point of that seam. I'm keeping my eye on that spot. I'm going to put my needle in. And I'll line it up so that I can follow along the other side of the chest seam. So I want to make sure that that's pushed under and past the center. So before I turn it right side out, I want to clip any curve. And here we are at the junction of the legs. And I want to clip to the point diagonally to where I pivoted, where I put my needle in and pivoted. Like that. Now let's see how that looks when we try to open it out. There it is. Now it's time to stuff it. That's where we put the polyfill in. Alright, this is kind of funny, stuffing it through the rear end like that. First you want to get up into the head and make sure the nose is stuffed nicely. And then you want to get the legs. Make sure you get that stuffing all the way up to the hooves. After all the legs are filled, you like to get into the neck and work your way back. Chest. There it is. There's my unicorn. Now all I have to do is stitch up the butt, and I'll just hand stitch that shut.